Okay, so hello everybody. I want to get started because I'm kind of already running behind in the class. Now basically each lecture I will briefly review the prior week's discussion and lecture, and then we'll delve into some new material each time. So understanding that some of this we've already talked about a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and sort of get started on the actual lecture. Now, you know, I often make analogies or parallels to the sort of things that have happened so rapidly in digital media in the past, say, 20 to 30 years, to what was happening right at the beginning of photography, those initial, you know, 30, 40 years. There were extremely fast innovations that were happening very rapidly, that things started out very kludgy. If anybody remembers AOL and MySpace, and then it sort of very quickly, you know, moved along to much more sophisticated kinds of technologies that were used to make images. And so at first, remember our real sort of beginning of what we call photography. You know, it started with the camera obscura, which had been known for centuries, if not millennia, and moved very quickly, no, very slowly, from the darkened room with a hole in one side to a chemical means of fixing that image, what we would call photography. And by the way, the word photography is a sort of mash of two Greek words, photos, which is light, and graphis, which is write or draw, right? So photography is light writing or light drawing. And so that's the definition of the medium that I use still. I think that it really defines the medium very effectively. That photography is an ability to write with light. And so there we have our kind of, you know, beginning of the discipline of the medium. At first, when they did discover the first few chemical means, remember the first one was the Nicéphore Niepce image of his backyard, sort of looking out the window at Le Gras, right, in southern France. Southern France has got kind of the same weather as Florida, right? So it's very bright in the summer, very warm and hot. So those summer days in the south of France, you know, they put out a lot of light. And even still, the exposure for that first photograph, the view of out the window at Le Gras, was hours, probably almost all day. So slowly other people, and remember the two main sort of people that we attribute to be the people that invented photography, which really is a misnomer because it was a lot of people sort of coming up with similar ideas all over.
But I have a quick question. With this photo, so they had, I'm reading, a Confederate prisoner of war. They had him stand there in that position for an hour.
No, not this picture. I'm still reviewing before what happened. Okay. You know, what happened in the last two lectures. So the first two guys that we sort of say invented photography were Daguerre in France, right? He invented the daguerreotype, and I showed you some examples of that and my own examples, and I'll show you some more of those today. Which, remember, if you look at it just right, it looks great, but if you're sort of at an angle, it looks like a mirror, right? And somebody mentioned that it looks like a mirror, and I said, well, they actually called it a mirror with a memory. And remember, the advantage of the daguerreotype was that it was very sharp, like frighteningly sharp to people in that time. The more you magnified it, the more details you could see. You could see this, read the sign a block away in a streetscape. And so that was, you know, the huge advantage of the daguerreotype was its sharpness and the fact that it was free to use, that nobody had to pay a licensing fee. That very quickly after its invention, you could sort of go to a camera store like B&H or something and buy the equipment pre-made. You didn't have to know how to make lenses and make your own cameras and mix your own chemistry, but you could sort of go to a store and buy the stuff and open a studio you know, with very little sort of technical knowledge of how to manufacture those things by yourself. Now, the disadvantage, of course, of the daguerreotype is that there's only one, right? So the polished copper plate that was silvered goes into the camera. It's what the picture is made on, and that's what the client receives or the photographer, you know, has after the picture is taken, meaning there's no negative, there's no digital file, it's one of a kind. I compared it to a Polaroid. If anybody remembers Polaroid, I know they're sort of hip again. It's a song, Shake It Like a Polaroid. And anyways, you know, it is a unique image, which in some ways is fantastic. I mean, dealers love that idea, that there art gallerists and stuff love that there's only one. So it's like a painting in that sense. There's only one of them. And the other competing inventor was a guy in England known as William Henry Fox Talbot. And Fox Talbot's process was different. It was on paper, right? It was a process that the paper that went into the camera formed a negative, and then you would print the negative into a positive, and you could make, you know, as many copies of that picture, at least theoretically, as you wanted, like we can do with a digital photograph. We can print it over and over and over and over again, and it won't degrade in any way. So that was a great thing about the Fox Talbot's process, which is generally known as the calotype, C-A-L-O-T-Y-P-E, although technically that only refers to the negative. And it's sometimes called the Talbotype, named after him, you know, Talbot, Fox Talbot. But of course, the disadvantage of the Talbotype or the calotype, the Fox Talbot's process, was that first of all, he was a very greedy businessman, and he demanded that everyone pay a licensing fee. And that licensing fee in that era was very expensive. It would cost, you know, most working people, most the sort of the middle class, if you will, was beginning to evolve. It was still very, you know, at the very beginning of the idea of something between pure labor workers and the 1% elites. But there became this kind of growing middle class. None of those people could really afford to pay the licensing fee. So that was one disadvantage to the calotype or the Talbotype, was that it was expensive. And secondarily, it wasn't as sharp. It was not as sharp as the daguerreotype because the negative was on paper. Even though they very quickly learned how to wax the paper to make it translucent, there was still the paper grains themselves that were transferred to the positive print to make it not as sharp as the daguerreotype. So both of these processes sort of came out almost simultaneously. Daguerre sold his process to the state of France, meaning that anybody could use it for free. They just had to buy the stuff, the camera and the chemicals and stuff. On the other hand, Fox Talbot kept the copyright and all the ownership to himself. And so ultimately, because the daguerreotype was cheaper to do, they became much more popular than Fox Talbot's process, which was much more expensive than the daguerreotype. So at the sort of initial invention of photography, the daguerreotype was the thing. And I showed a slide of daguerreotype mania, where it seemed like every street corner in Paris had a photography studio opening up. This was the idea that now the sort of regular folk, people who work for a living like us, could have a portrait made, as opposed to only, you know, the rich 1% elites who could sit still for a couple of months and not do any work to have someone paint them. Now, sort of regular folk could get a picture made. Now, again, at the beginning, and I mean, really at the beginning of the daguerreotype mania, it was still kind of expensive. It'd take like a week's salary. Yeah, it's a lot of money, right? But then it very quickly, because of competition and because the cost of the materials got cheaper as they made more and more of them, went down in price. And it became more and more popular and more common for people to have their portraits made. Now, it was still a big deal. You know, people back then, and I'm only talking, you know, 150, 175 years ago, probably didn't have more than 2 or 3 photographs ever made of them. Like this was even one for the elderly people was kind of, you know, a big deal. And so photography started slowly. The daguerreotype process was kind of the first really popular one. It was super sharp and free. And then there was the stuff in England, the Talbotype, the calotype that was expensive, but it was reproducible. And that idea of the negative ultimately, at least in my opinion, caught on. It took a while, but the idea that you would have a negative that you could make multiple prints of became an idea that was, you know, really became much more popular as photography evolved into the next few steps of its evolution. So I just wanted to mention this picture because you know, it's kind of an early an early example of a news photograph. This is one of the men who was convicted and then ultimately hung for executing Lincoln and for planning and shooting Lincoln in the head. And so, you know, it's kind of like a mugshot essentially. So this is one of the earlier mugshots. And of course, he's quite the handsome young man as well. So there's a kind of bad boy quality to him that is kind of attractive in some ways. So I'm going to just sort of go through starting now to, so one of my favorite authors, by the way, is Douglas Adams. He's probably best known for The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And there was a show recently about one of his other books. But he came up with this idea about technology. And so anything in the world, anything that is in the world when you were born, that's normal, it's ordinary, and it's just a natural part of the world, how the world works. Anything that's invented between when you're 15 and 35 is new and exciting and revolutionary, and you can probably get a career in it. That's kind of what happened, luckily for me. Digital photography occurred when I was sort of in my late 20s, early 30s. I was a sort of cutting edge person at that time in the field, and I was able to build a career in this new technology. Anything invented after you're 35 is just against the natural order of things, and I'll never understand it. I don't get TikTok. I don't understand why people do these other kinds of social media, right? So, you know, there is a kind of, and it gets harder and harder for me to like deal with software, especially software that sucks, like Blackboard. And so, you know, there is a kind of, and you'll find, I think that this is pretty true as you age, that, you know, at a certain point you just say, that's enough, my brain's full, you know. And actually for me, I returned to film photography. I've returned to large format photography, even though I was able to build a career in digital photography, in teaching it, in making it, and doing it. But there was a certain charm about these traditional processes that I still kind of love. So I put these two on the link for last week. You should have had a look at them. And if you remember, these are actually a few years old now, but they were these examples of, I guess some people call them deep fakes. This idea that you can have like one person.
Since our method only uses RGB data for both the source.
Let me just change the, are you seeing the video or not? Yes or
no?
No.
It was just a white screen with a cursor on it.
Yeah. Right. So, all right. So, yes, I know it's still, you know, it's Bush, and it's so it really shows that this was, you know, more than 4 years ago. But the idea is that this guy on the right, this kind of average plump white guy with weird hair, when he speaks, you'll see that Bush mimics his mouth. So they're using a video camera on this Joe, right? And then W here will say whatever Joe says. So here we go.
Source and target actor, we are able to manipulate YouTube videos in real time. Here we demonstrate our method in a live setup. On the right, a source actor is captured with a standard webcam. This input drives the animation of the face in the video shown on the monitor to the left. A significant difference to previous methods is the re-rendering of the mouth interior. To this end, we resynthesized the mouth interior of the target actor using video footage from the training sequence based on temporal and photometric similarity. As we can see, we are able to generate a realistic and convincing reenactment result. Here, we show a close-up of the footage from the previous live reenactment. The input video stream is shown on the left. Note that the target actor is re-rendered in a neutral pose. On the right, we can see the final output of our method.
All right, so that's and by the way, Adobe, made it clear that they could have integrated that into versions of Adobe Premiere, their video editing program, years ago, but they decided that it wasn't a good time to do that, so they didn't. And so let me just get my other window out so I know what I'm doing. Here it is. And share this screen and hit play again. And all right, so in reference to like what's going on right now, I just wanted to mention it today at about 4 o'clock after our class today. There's going to be yet another probe landing on Mars, and just the incalculable difficulty of basically shooting a bullet at something that far away that's in motion, as are we in motion, and hitting your target, much less landing something on that target that far away in the place you want it, is utterly amazing. And so, but the probe today, its purpose is to look for microbial life in the soil, see if there's anything, little tiny things growing in the dirt on Mars. Doesn't sound like a lot of fun, but it's kind of still an amazing thing, and you might want to watch it land because that's pretty cool. So, so these are sort of links that are also on the syllabus of different museums and other kinds of places that talk about some of these early photographic processes that we're going to sort of talk about and already have introduced. So it's the wiki timeline of photography. And so here's the kind of really fast view that I've actually highlighted the things that I think you should make note of in this lecture. So last week, we talked about Niesfor Niepce's first photograph, right? If you don't remember, it was essentially tar scraped thinly on a piece of pewter, stuck into a sort of camera obscura with a lens and pointed out the window. The tar hardened where the sun hit it. It stays soluble or soft where the sun didn't hit it, and then washed it off. And whatever tar was left made the shadows on the plate. And so Fox Talbot sort of figures out that silver chloride, in other words, silver mixed with salt, is a light sensitive material. It changes, it gets darker when sunlight hits it. Daguerre in Paris invents the daguerreotype, which is also based on silver. If you remember, it was a copper plate that was thinly silver plated with a cheap silver, polished to a high shine, and then sort of iodine was boiled and the iodine gas struck the silver, making silver iodide rather than silver chloride, but it's still a salt, and it became light sensitive. And so those first three people, right? We have Niesfor Niepce, we have Fox Talbot, and we have Daguerre. All of these processes were known until this guy, Sir John Herschel, who really needs to be known a lot better than he is, because he also invented cyanotype. But he came up with this stuff called what we call fixer. And if anybody's ever been in a darkroom, you know what fixer is. It's the stuff that prevents the picture from continuing to darken when you bring it into the white light. So prior to 1839, although these pictures, they knew how to make them, they didn't know how to keep them from like destroying themselves when they came into the regular light. And so fixer's invention, although not quite as sexy as like, Daguerre or Fox Talbot's, is a crucial part of this early inventions of photography. So this was the first color photograph. It's called a Becquerel process. And we'll talk more about that later in the semester. But then came along collodion. And we're going to talk a little bit about collodion today. I haven't talked about it yet, but it was kind of the next, like the third great process, right? If we have daguerreotypes and calotypes at the beginning, the third one became the collodion process. And then, a little bit later, Kodak came up with flexible film. That was really their first major invention, is that the stuff that went in the camera was no longer rigid, like a piece of metal, a piece of paper, or a piece of glass, which is what collodion used, but was instead on a roll. And you could load the camera with a roll of light sensitive negative material. And so they came up with the first camera that was, I use the word idiot proof. Their slogan was, you press the button, we do the rest. This was a box camera. It was literally a box that, there was only one thing you could do, and that's to sort of press the button. And then you had to wind it, of course, but then you press the button again and you wind it. And you could do that 100 times and you'd get 100 pictures back from Kodak. That's the first time people said, oh, photography's dead. We don't need professional photographers anymore. Anybody's a photographer. Why do we need pros? Of course, that was bullshit and it still is. Like, people say that with the invention of the phone camera, right? That now we don't need professional photographers because everybody's got a camera in their pocket. And but it's not true. I mean, it's just like saying everybody's got a word processor and that means everybody's a writer. It's not. It just doesn't make the same sense, right? And so, the Brownie became very popular. Here's another one of the earlier color photographs. These were by taking 3 separate pictures and then printing the red and then the green and then the in this case, cyan, red, and yellow layers in sequence. Cameras got smaller, they got faster. The Leica camera specifically became a small, portable, easily carried roll film camera. And then, we saw some cameras last week that were kind of the major innovations of the decades. I showed you that Kodak sort of invented the first digital photograph. And then the Polaroid camera was another sort of major innovation, the instant photograph. And so we'll talk about some of those things. Now, in any technology, there is a kind of adoption cycle or a technology life cycle. And so the very beginning are the innovators, the people who are willing to spend, whatever it takes to get that thing, Tesla, Apple iPhone 11.972, right? And so those are like the people who make the whatever technology it is, sort of more and more affordable, because the more people who are willing to pay tons of money at the beginning, the more money the companies have to make more of the gizmos, the objects. And then there's the early adopters, the people who are like, well, I'll wait a little bit, but I really want the latest phone. I want the latest camera. I need the more and more megapixels. I want more ISO in my low light ISO thing. I need a faster lens. I want the best lens ever made. Those are the early adopters. And then sort of the rest of us go, okay, well, iPhone 11.972 has been out for a couple of months. It's, prices come down a couple $100. Maybe I'll go for it now. I couldn't afford it at the beginning. My old phone was still fine, but now I really like this one. I'm still 2 phones behind. So, and then the people whose iPhone 6 finally breaks and they get the iPhone 11.972 or whatever. And then, and then there's the ones like, oh, look, there's a new iPhone 6 that you can buy for $99. I'll get that for my kid because he's going to break it every week, right? So, this is the standard life size of anything, a car, it's like any piece of technology kind of goes through this thing. The more innovative the technology it is, the more this kind of life cycle is, the more pronounced it is. And so, you know, one of the people that science fiction in its way has always been a kind of, you know, leader for technology. And so, you know, even Steve Jobs admitted that the iPad was based on something he saw in Star Trek, that, you know, William Gibson is an author he invented the word cyberspace, and he sort of wrote the first novels about being jacked into the net. And these are all terms, maybe not jacked in anymore, but terms that we still use today. And so these are kind of people who generally sort of try to predict what's coming next. And so I'm going to skip this because it's not so interesting these days. But and so here we talked about, remember those things, I just went through these. We also talked a little bit about Anna Atkins and her cyanotypes. I do have a cyanotype here that I'll show you later. I'll just do them all together. An early cyanotype. There's Daguerre himself. There's his camera on the bottom left. The early photographs, because the long exposure times were usually still things that didn't move, still life objects, not really portraits yet. Right, here's the first photograph of a human being. That dude in the lower left corner getting his shoes shined. That's the very first picture of a human. Remember that this is a very busy street in Paris. There would have been people promenading. That's what they do in Paris, apparently. They just promenade, right? They walk along the streets and promenade. There would have been horse-drawn carriages on the street itself. It would have been a very busy scene. But since none of it stood still enough, long enough, none of those things were recorded onto the plate, the copper daguerreotype plate. And so this guy, and it might even be more than one guy, by the way, did stand there long enough. Probably both feet had to be shined and, you know, boot blacked and all that stuff. And so he was captured on this early daguerreotype. Now this is the very first Talbotype or calotype. This is the image that Fox Talbot made. And I explained last time, I think, about how taxes were based on how many windows you had. And so this is a kind of like showing off his bling, like, look, I can afford all these windows. And so there's Fox Talbot himself with his camera in his hand. And these are some of the early portraits that were made with the Talbot type process. There's him again. And remember, it was a positive negative process. And I showed these, that the image on the left is the negative that would have been in the camera, and the image on the right was the print that came from it. So this is Talbot's studio in the backyard of his estate. And so there's some more examples of it. These are some early camera obscuras or Talbot type cameras. And things got more and more sophisticated, as we'll see today, but there's another version of latticed window. There's some examples of daguerreotypes by Southworth and Hawes, generally considered to be the first masters of portraiture. And these are small. They would have fit in your hand very comfortably. And they would have been protected in these very elaborate kinds of cases to make sure that no oxygen got to the thin surface layer of silver on the copper plate, because that would then tarnish it and degrade it. If you touch these with the oils on your fingers, that would eventually turn black, and you would have this big black thumbprint or fingerprint on the pictures. And so they had to be, you know, encased in glass and stuff. One of the other things I haven't mentioned about daguerreotypes is that everything in the picture is reversed. That the text, you know, like you'll see cafe, and you know, the words on the picture are like flipped. And that was because, at least in Talbot's process, you'd get a negative that was flipped, and then you'd print it as a positive, and everything would be back to normal. In this process, your, you know, wedding ring would be on the wrong hand. You know, anything that was left versus right, anything that had text on it would have been flipped. It became more and more sort of commonplace for people to sort of get together and go and hang out and take pictures together, doing more and more odd things. Then the lenses began to get better and better and better. Of course, that really meant that the pictures would take less and less time. The brighter the lens, the less time it takes to make the exposure. They were generally brass barrel lenses, we call them. People still sort of crave these things because they're kind of beautiful objects and still make great pictures. But the lenses at the very beginning, this is the very first lens ever made, by the way. And lens comes from the word lentil, like a bean. It's a double convex, which is the standard kind of shape of a magnifying glass lens that you might use to look at something small, or that your older friends might take to look at to thread a needle or something. And so the basic first lens, which was made in Egyptian times, 8th century BC. And again, I don't care if you know that date per much, as much that it was like over 1,000 years ago. But this was the very first lens. By the way, they made these to start fires. That was the purpose of early lenses, is so they could, easily, it was before matches and a lighter or whatever. This was the fastest way to start a fire, was to, magnify the light into that little dot and do it on something like papyrus to start a quick fire. It's also the same shape as the lens in our eye. And so all of us have different kinds of sight, but technically if you have 20/20 vision, the lens in your eye is shaped like the meniscus lens, the Nimrod lens, a bean. You got a bean in your eye, right? Sometimes as you age, the shape of that lens changes. Many people are born with nearsightedness or farsightedness, or at least that develops over time. Generally, for most people, the older you get, the more farsighted you become, and we start to have to wear glasses, reading glasses, cheaters, so to speak. My wife is nearsighted, which means she can see things close up without glasses, but needs them to see things far away. And this is generally because of the shape of that lens that's in your eye. And so the better the lenses got, they started adding, you'll see in this case, a second, what we call element down in the lower left. You'll see the meniscus lens, but also another lens in front of that to make the images brighter, but also with less distortion. Because what happens with the meniscus lens is they're very sharp in the middle, but the further out from the center of the image you go, the softer it gets. And there's lens distortion, all kinds of it. There's lots of it, different kinds of lens distortion. But basically the first camera lenses were to A, make the image brighter, and B, to try to begin to reduce that kind of distortion found on the outer circle of the lens. So this is the first landscape lens. It was just 2 elements, and the first portrait lens, also 2 elements times 2. So now there's 4 elements. All the modern lenses that we still use on any kind of camera, including the ones in your pocket or your purse, are based on these early designs. They just got more and more complicated in the way that they put more and more elements in them to reduce distortion. And so these are the basic kinds of lens elements. You don't need to know these by any means, but in any kind of camera lens, there's a sort of an arrangement of these kinds of things in different order. And modern lenses often have up to like 8 to 12 elements, individual elements in them. And so if you're a photographer, if you've ever heard this term apo lens, what's an apo lens? Generally lenses initially start as a sort of, it almost looks like a crystal ball. like a big softball-sized piece of glass that is then slices of it are taken off to create those elements that I showed you here. And so those are all based on a sphere. But an apo lens is the original shape was not a sphere. And so this is something called a lens bench, and you can combine different elements with different lasers to see how the images are formed on the actual focal plane, which is the thing that takes the picture, right? In the 19th century, that was either a daguerreotype plate or a piece of paper. Now it's a sensor. In the 20th century, it was film. But what happens essentially is that different versions of glass elements focus the image on the thing that takes the picture. So another important part of any camera is the shutter. Now, the shutter used to be take the lens cap off, count 1 Ansel Adams, 2 Ansel Adams, 3 Ansel Adams, put the lens cap back on. That obviously is not very accurate. And once you start wanting to stop things in motion, like this horse guy here, it's not very effective. And so there's a story, apocryphal story, about this guy who was Leland Stanford was his name. And you might have heard that because there's Stanford University is named after him. Leland Stanford was a horse breeder. And he wanted to see how his horses, his very expensive, thoroughbred racehorses, how they ran. He wanted to be able to sort of analyze their thing. And if you look at a horse with human eyes, you cannot see this, okay? They run so fast, their legs move so quickly that we have no idea visually how a horse's hooves canter. And so he paid this guy, he hired this guy, I should say, named Edward Muybridge. And Muybridge is a totally fascinating character. He had 4 or 5 names. He was a killer. He shot his wife's lover and walked away with it. He's a really fascinating guy. But Leland Stanford hired Muybridge to solve a bet. And so the bet was whether or not when a horse gallops, that its hooves, all 4 of the hooves come off the ground at once. Don't remember the names of the guy he was betting with, but one guy said, yes, they're all 4 off the ground at once. The other guy said, no, they're not. I'll bet you whatever money and okay, let's solve this. Let's figure out a way to photograph a horse in its full gallop. And so Muybridge figured out a way to make a shutter. Now, a shutter is essentially just a little window that opens and closes kind of quickly so that we can see, so that the light that comes through the lens is only briefly open, right? So that the lens is only briefly open. And here's the very first picture of Sally Gardner, Leland Stanford's horse, galloping. And of course, we now see that, yes, of course, the hoofs of the horse all do come up off the ground. Now, if you look at paintings before these pictures were made, anything before 1878, you will see the horse's hooves like doing all kinds of weird shit. I mean, they're just flailing in like, they don't know. So they just made it up. And now they knew. And so Muybridge figured out that, so this is his system, by the way. It wasn't a single camera. The initial one was 12 cameras in a row. There was a thin piece of sewing thread that went from the camera to the back of the set. This was done in Southern California where it was very sunny. And then there were 12 cameras in a row. And when the horse went through and broke the thread, it fired the shutter. And by the way, high-speed shutter at that time was a 15th of a second, which is really, I mean, cameras do 4,000ths of a second now. So that was really not a big deal to us now, but then it was an amazingly fast shutter. And so this is the actual track they used. It went up to 24 cameras at one point. And so now Muybridge, This is them in motion. Muybridge and Stanford had a falling out. Stanford said that since he had paid Muybridge to invent the shutter, he owned it. In other words, Stanford owned it. Muybridge said, fuck you, man, I made it up. I invented it, it's mine. And so they had a falling apart. And so then at some point, ultimately, Muybridge moved, they sort of came to an agreement that Stanford could have it on the West Coast and that Muybridge could have it on the East Coast. And so he came back to the East Coast.
Professor, can I ask, like, so the shutter is the actual opening to let the light in, and that's the speed of that, like how fast it opens to let the light in?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So it's kind of like a curtain. That the early shutters were curtains, and there's sort of like a slot in the curtain, right? And it would sort of go like up and let light in. Just that. Now, if the top went up faster than the bottom, there'll be a slower shutter speed. And then let me just see if I can do this on the camera, right? So we've got this thing totally closed, and then it should be bigger, right? So then this one goes up, and then that goes up. And so only the time that like it's open is light getting through the lens to the light sensitive material, the plate. And so if one goes up, stays up before the second one goes up, then that's a longer shutter speed. But if one goes up and the second one just follows it up really quickly, then that's a shorter shutter speed. And so because of this invention, they were able to take, it's called animal locomotion is what he called the project. And he spent a significant portion of his life, and he's absolutely best known for these pictures of animals in motion, including humans, by the way. He got obsessed with it. And I mentioned that he was a really interesting guy. I'll tell one story about him now, and then I'll tell more at different parts of the semester. But when he was living on the West Coast, he was a landscape photographer before he became this guy. And while he was away, like, climbing up mountains with huge cameras, that even his Sherpas would say, like, no way, I'm going that way. He was often out of town, and town for him was San Francisco. And it became kind of more and more well known that his wife was stepping out on him while he was on these long, landscape photography excursions. And so he sort of tried to ignore it, but all his friends were saying, listen, we saw her with this guy at the theater last week while you were away, and we saw him with that guy again at dinner, and they seem to be very familiar with each other. And so ultimately, after a couple of years, Muybridge goes to his servant's house, his maid's house, his cleaner's house, and he sees a picture of his son, and on the back, there's a kind of like the lover was attributed as the father. And so he found out that his wife's, his own kid wasn't really his own kid, it was by this other man. And so he knew that. He finally had to acknowledge that this was true. He knew where the guy was. He played poker every Thursday night, let's say, at this other guy's house. And there was always like 4 to 6 guys there that played poker, and so he got his pistol. He walked over to the house. He knocked on the door. He said, "Is Joe Schmo here?" And Joe Schmo comes out. And he said, just blows him away right in front of 5 witnesses. Just shoots him right in front of everybody. So there's no question he did it. And then he finally, the law catches up to him, and he goes to court, and he says to the judge, like, that guy was sleeping with my wife. And the judge says, oh, okay, he deserved it. Bye, see ya. And so he just walked away. He literally got away with murder. And that's only one of many very interesting and strange stories about this guy. So shutter speeds have a very strong effect on the photograph. The faster the shutter speed, like on the very far left, that was actually spinning when the picture was taken, will freeze things in motion, like the horses. Slower shutter speeds will allow for blurred motion, like the center picture, and very slow shutter speeds, everything just becomes a sort of blur. And so here's the daguerreotype camera. You'll notice that the shutter, by the way, in this camera at the front of the lens, there's a little tab that you would sort of open and then close again. And that's the shutter on the camera. It was done by hand, not with a spring or any kind of mechanical device. And so this is kind of the second shutter, the leaf shutter. There's a hole, there's a small sort of thing on a spring that opens and closes by clicking the button, right? And so cameras got more and more sophisticated. They had faster and faster lenses. They had sharper and sharper lenses. They had faster and faster shutters. So again, it's not so important that you read this. It's basically just sort of discusses how Muybridge came up with the lens. Oh, and by the way, that thing I told you that it was a bet, it's not true. I mean, that's the story that everybody tells when they say, how did Muybridge come up with the fast shutter? They all tell this story that Leland Stanford had a bet about his horse Sally Mae, blah, 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 blah. Stanford was a very devout something or other religious, and he would never gamble. It was a sin in his book. So he never would have actually bet somebody whether or not a horse's hoofs came off the ground. But it's a good story to tell because people remember it that way. But I do want you to know that it's not a true story. And most people who know the story will correct it later. So this is the Packard shutter, which is also one that you could put in front of the lens. You had a squeeze ball that sort of forced some air through to open and close the ball, the shutter. This is the camera kind of shutter that we see in most DSLR style cameras and 35mm film cameras. That again, it's just a kind of window that opens and closes. You can see it's much more mechanically sophisticated with lots more gears and springs and all kinds of stuff in it than the simpler shutters that were made before it. But anyways, these are different, it doesn't matter. Okay, so there's basically a shutter in motion in a modern camera. Generally, they have a bunch of different leaves, and they will open and close at different speeds. Now, since in a fast shutter speed, when the first one comes up, the second one follows it very quickly, and there's like this slit of light that comes through. It's not like it opens all the way and closes all the way at once, but instead it sort of follows it up. Now, if you're panning the camera when this is happening, things that are moving fast get stretched. And you'll see this in sort of a lot of early photographs of especially cars, because you can see the wheels, which obviously were round, become these oval shapes because of the way the shutter opens. So, so the other thing that's I'm sort of disassembling a camera for most of you, that's important about a lens is how big its aperture is. Now, aperture is like your eyes, right? When you go into, when you come from a darkened place, like inside your house with the lights turned off, you open the front door and you walk out into the sunshine, your eyes shrink, right? You get that little tiny pupil, it goes really small. But then when you go into a darkened room and you sit for a while and your eyes are going to adjust to the light, that your pupil gets bigger. And that's exactly what an aperture in a camera is. It's this sort of device, in this case, that opens and closes to let more or less light in based on how much light you need to take the picture. And so this is a fairly modern aperture ring. It has a lot of blades on it, which for the photo nerds out there gives you very nice bokeh. That's that out of focus stuff behind the people, right? The kind of blur in the background. And so, which is not really a word. They say it's a Japanese word. It's just nonsense. They made it up. And so the more blades, the better your bokeh is in the background. And so this is kind of a very nice aperture device. Early aperture devices were really just a piece of metal with a hole in it. And I'll show you one of those. So there's a stack of them on the left, the Waterhouse stops. You can see next to the brass lens on the left, there's a stack of these metal plates with holes in them at different sizes. And so that's an early aperture device. They were sometimes called pillbox stops or washer stops. And then ultimately the Waterhouse stops came along. And then they started inventing more and more sophisticated ones, like the first one I showed, like the iris, like our eye, which can open and close that way. And so,
is the shutter behind or in front of the aperture? Just curious.
It's usually in front of the aperture's in front of the shutter. So it opens and then the shutter will open. So let me get a lens. I'll be right back. Okay, so now, as I open and close this aperture ring, you can see that it just gets bigger and smaller. Now, it's harder to see from that direction, so let me just get closer in this direction. And now, what happens in modern lenses is that it stays wide open until you take the picture, and then it quickly stops down and then it opens up again. But this lens is in front of the camera, and so the aperture is in the lens, not in, the shutter's behind it, rather than in front of it. Now, again, for photo nerds, the wider this opens, the more expensive the lens is. So, this is an f3.5 lens, which is not so great, but the same focal length, right? 55 millimeter lens. If it had an f2.8 instead of 3.5, it'd be another couple $100. If it went in the 1 point something range, it'd be another couple $100. And so, the same focal length lens can have different prices based on how wide that aperture gets.
And that aperture is a iris.
Right.
Okay.
And that's the thing that causes pictures to be in focus from front to back, or just the subject in focus and everything else out of focus. So in portraiture, you'll often notice the person is sharp and the background is fuzzy. And so that's what happens when the iris is all the way open. And then if you stop it way down, everything from the foreground to the background, which is often the case in landscape photography, is in focus. So the smaller the hole, the more what we call depth of field, or in focusness. Now, this is Irving Penn's studio, and it still kind of exists, but this was a very popular design for photography studios for 100 and something years. It was a daylight studio, and the windows would be, sort of north light studios, so they would be facing the north, and using those pieces of burlap that you see at the top, they could change the way the light is. So it's sunlight coming through the windows, and you change the quality of light and the amount of light by adding more and more, or less and less, of those kind of burlap sacks. There's a story about this that Penn hired and he was thinking of hiring a new assistant. This assistant was so excited to work with the great Irving Penn that he came in hours early and he cleaned all the windows. And Penn was furious because he had this nice layer of dust on them that made this beautiful soft light come through the window. And once you clean them all, then the light is all really sharp and hard and not as flattering to the subject as when the windows were dusty and dirty. And so He never got the job. You
I
know,
have a question. Um,
of course,
it's like a greenhouse, right? The
yes.
roof is glass, and then he would change the material on it as
Oh,
the
look at
day went on.
Look at the top of the picture here. Do you see that there's like burlap sacks up there?
Yes, the sacks. He would change it, or
Yes, he could add more sacks to put less light in, or he could remove sacks, the burlap things to let less light or more light through. Sometimes we'll see in another picture, they would put up like a kind of translucent sheet, like a thin white sheet to let the light come through soft. But when there's nothing on the windows, the light is very hard, crisp, causes a deep shadow.
just last question, because for painting, they say that the windows should be to the north. Do you know if they use this in photography, windows to special direction, north, south?
Yes, they were called Northlight Studios. And it's actually still available to rent in Midtown Manhattan, and it's actually named now the Northlight Studio. A photography organization is there and rents the studio out still. Omari, I see you have your hand up.
Oh yeah, I'm trying to put some definitions next to some of these words I'm writing down as you're talking. But the iris, what is that specifically like used for in the camera? That's just for like brightness and darkness. What is? I was confused about that.
Yeah, it's like your eye, right? When you go into a dark room, it opens up, your pupil opens up. When you come out into the bright sun, your pupil shrinks. It lets more or less light in, depending on how much light you need. So if your retina is kind of like the film or the digital sensor, let more or less light hit your retina, the aperture or the iris is exactly the same thing.
Right.
But you took
So the aperture, yeah.
Right. So you know that a wide aperture gives you shallow depth of field, and one part of the picture is sharp, one part's not, and a smaller aperture gives you wider depth of field. But
oh, it's for depth of field. Okay.
Any other questions? Did I answer the studio question? Okay. So other pieces of studio equipment that were very popular. One that is extremely misunderstood is the sort of head rack. And you can see here a kind of a caricature of people going to have their picture taken where their heads are kind of screwed into this this headrest rack. It wasn't a kind of torture. They didn't screw it on so tight that you felt like it was going into your head in any way. It was just something that you could rest against because the exposures at the time were still in, half a second. While that may not seem that long to us as human beings, to a camera, it is very long. And so the headrests were very popular. This is a friend of mine's studio that lives in Rochester. It is also a Northlight studio, as you will see. This would be a fairly common setup in a 19th century portrait studio. Camera would have been mounted on some sort of a movable tripod or something. In this case, you can see on the left, on the lights, there are these little strings coming down where they can open and close the curtains to let more or less light through. And there was this posing chair, which was a very common one. There's the head rests behind the chair. And then on sort of our left of the posing chair is something called a Brady table, invented by a photographer named Matthew Brady. And they were very popular, where people could sort of lean on them, again, so that they would be still for the longer exposure times that we would have. Now, on the right, you see, I won't go there yet, but so this is actually Penn's old studio, which is now the Northlight studio in Manhattan. Same idea. we use these things, we call them flags or reflectors on stands to either bounce light back into a picture or to cut light if it's black to reduce light. That's called a flag. So, and here's another one, the Northlight Studio and Mark Studio. He's just using a big sort of piece of like kind of translucent cloth to alter the quality of the light coming through the Northlight Studio. Here's another Northlight Studio. If you know what you're looking for and you drive like into upstate New York and some of the older towns, you can spot them. Like now they've all been bricked over, but it's clearly like this weird shape that's been bricked over that looks exactly like a Northlight Studio. So here it is from the subject, from behind the subject's point of view. And you'll see that she's got the rack behind her head, but it's not like crimped onto her neck or anything. It's just something to lean back against. And because it's invisible, because it's behind her, you don't see that. It just makes it more comfortable to sit still for that few, milliseconds. There's another one of the standard portrait cameras that were very common at the time, and a hand-drawn or hand-painted backdrop. So again, as photography became more and more popular, you would become able to buy these backdrops, or you would have them custom painted for photo studios. And here's another use of the headrest. So there's the Brady stand, right? And you'd see it you can see on the right pictures, there's all different kinds of uses for it. It could just be a table, it could be a prop of some kind, etc. And the subjects would be sort of able to kind of lean against it or rest against it. I see a hand up. Who is that? I don't have a name.
Oh, it's me.
Hi,
Carol. Hi.
Yeah.
I had a question. I always wondered, like, what was the purpose of the photographer having that black drape over his head? The black, what is it, like a drape? The photographer covers his head to look through the camera. What is that about?
Let's see if I can show one. Yeah, so it's just resting on the stand behind the camera right now. So what happens is the light comes through the lens and it's projected upside down and backwards onto that thing at the back of the camera, which is called a ground glass. And the image, in the bright light that it takes to make a picture, you can barely see that image on the ground glass. So if you put the hood over your head, what we call the dark cloth, and sort of go inside that, I use a t-shirt sometimes, or I have better ones, but and it will the image that's on the back of the camera that the photographer is using to frame the image and to focus the picture is much brighter. Now it's upside down and backwards, which at first you'd think is, oh my God, how can you deal with that? But oddly, your brain actually fixes that pretty quickly, and it becomes kind of natural. And so the more you do it, the more easy it is to see the world upside down and backwards. This is how, it's interesting to mention that this is how the image is formed on our retina as well. And so our brain flips it over for us. And so really, like the mechanical action of human seeing, everything is upside down and backwards. But the intellectual process of perception, which is different than the mechanical part of seeing, but the way our brain perceives things, it just automatically flips it over for us. So that's kind of interesting. But the dark cloth anyways is so that the photographer can see the image more clearly on the back of the camera. So, all right, so we talked about the Brady stand, which is almost universal prop in almost every photography studio at the time. These were the caricatures of, like, it seemed like some sort of torture device, but it really wasn't that. There's another example of it. So when you're doing a standing subject, there would also be a brace behind your back to sort of help you stand perfectly still for the seconds of exposure that was there. And then another very common piece of equipment in a photo studio at the time was this. Now, this is basically Photoshop in the 19th century. People think that people started manipulating photographs when Photoshop was invented in 1990. It's absolutely not true. People have manipulated photographs since the very invention of photography. And so this is an example of a retouching stand where the glass plate negative would go onto this thing. The light from the window coming through would allow the retoucher, which was sometimes a separate person from the photographer, but was usually the photographer, to retouch the glass plate, often using soft pencils and this stuff called opaque, which is just a kind of black paint. And so for an example of an early version of so-called Photoshop, I have this Annie Brigman photograph. She's a pictorialist photographer. We'll talk about more at another time. But this one is kind of one of her better known images. She often made images about sort of women and nature, this idea of how women are sort of a Gaia. It's a Gaia mythology, if anybody knows what that means. It's kind of like worshiping women as women are creators, the bringers of life, and linking that to nature and how nature and Gaia sort of go along together. Gaia is a mythological god. And so, you know, she would take the original negative, which you see here. This would have been the thing that came out of the camera. And then she, and you can see that there's a lot of clutter and that the exposure's kind of garish and the light's kind of really contrasty. And so then she made a print, or in this case, we just inverted that negative digitally, right? And so, and you can see that it's really not very attractive. So then she photographed the original negative that gave her a positive, what we call an interpositive. She then drew all over that and scratched things to remove parts of the image. The interpositive was rephotographed to get another negative that was then printed like so. And so it was basically, she took the picture, she made a picture of the picture and painted and drew and scratched on it. She took another picture of the picture of the picture that she'd taken to get a second negative, and then she printed that second negative from the interpositive. And this is her at work in her retouching studio. So, you know, the idea that, you know, manipulating images, whether it be to, you know, transform the shape of the human body, change the shape of a smile, or the brightness of an eye, or the texture of skin, that is commonplace now, was also well known in the past, prior to Photoshop. There's certain common techniques. I have a couple of these that I'll show you later, that this is also often known as the hidden mother, right? So you want a picture of your newborn baby, but newborn babies don't like to sit still, and exposure time is 5 seconds long, especially they don't like to sit still when there's really bright light in their face. And so moms would sort of put on a piece of cloth over them and then, you know, hold the baby in their lap. And these are called hidden mothers pictures. Manipulating photographs became, you know, it became a kind of funny thing to do. This technique became really popular for a brief period of time. It's simply double exposure, but and this is the beginning of the time when, you know, this belief, this idea that I think many people still hold, that, you know, if it's a photograph, it must be true. I mean, we all know, all of you probably, most of you at least, grew up with Photoshop. I mean, it's edged in 1990. So if you're not 32 years or older, Photoshop has been around all your life. And so you've consciously know that any photograph you see can have been manipulated. But most of us still want to believe somehow unconsciously that photographs are true. Unlike paintings, unlike any other discipline, any other medium, photography is truth to some people. Now, we know that rationally, we know that can't be right. And yet we sort of unconsciously still believe in this medium in a way that's inaccurate. So, these things are kind of strange and odd, but this was a huge sort of like a popular, it's like a meme. There we go. It's like a 19th century meme. It became a thing briefly and then it disappeared, but it was a thing. So we talked about lanterns and magic lantern shows, so I'm not going to go over these again. Another sort of early innovation in photographic processes was the stereoscope. Now, Oliver Wendell Holmes, the judge, the philosopher, the author, was also a tinkerer. And he sort of thought about photography and said, well, when we see the world in the real world, we see depth. We see things in 3 dimensions. But when I look at a photographic print, everything is flat. There's no depth. And so I would like pictures that are kind of more like the world, that have depth. And he said, well, it's probably because we have 2 eyes. And that's why we have depth perception, because one eye sees things slightly differently than the other. If you put your finger close in front of your face and you close one eye and see, it looks like your finger's moving, and of course it isn't, right? And so the closer things are to you, the more pronounced the difference between one eye and the other eye's image sees. The further things are away, the less difference they see. And so he invented a camera that had 2 lenses in it and took 2 separate pictures at the same instant and then mounted them on cards called stereo cards. And he invented this viewer that when you looked through it, the only thing the lens did in the viewer was instead, if there's something like 6 inches in front of your face, your eyes are going to try to converge on it. But the lenses just force them to keep looking straight. And you can train your eyes, people like stereoscope nerds train their eyes to do that without using a scope. But most people still needed the stereopticon, which is what it was called, a stereopticon. These were incredibly popular. I just have to mention, like in most sort of middle-class homes, people had one of these. They were almost as popular as televisions were in the 19th century, early 20th century, as popular as computers and iPhones, or I should say phones, are now. And so almost every family had one, and the illusion is really kind of pronounced. I mean, it's really an amazing thing. And it's very, it's exactly the same, by the way, as virtual reality is now. So all these new VR headsets that you can get for gaming or other kinds of immersive experiences, they use the exact same idea that your eye sees 2 slightly different images, and that's what like forms depth. Oh, and we also have that with our ears, by the way. We have 2 ears, so we can tell the direction of a sound, because one ear hears the sound slightly earlier than the other one does, and we know it's on that side of us. So the stereopticon, the home stereoscope, became a very popular kind of entertainment. You would have friends over and you could all sort of go to these places. And that's the thing about it. It was like television or like the digital revolution, in the sense that you could sit at home in your parlor, drawing room, whatever, your living room, and you could kind of virtually travel to other places without physically going there. And so another thing about early photography that is almost impossible for 21st century people to remember is that it brought the world to us. Prior to the invention of photography, prior to the invention of the stereoscope in particular, because they were very popular, people rarely saw things more than a day or two's horseback ride away from it. If you went 100 miles away, that was pretty far, you know, and you'd stay a couple of days because it took a lot of effort to get there. But it was highly unlikely that anybody would go to other countries, encounter other cultures, see things that they'd only read about in books like the pyramids of Giza or, you know, the wonders of the world. And so stereo photography in virtual reality brought the world from far, far away into our homes. And so they're also kind of like, I don't know if it's going to work with your generation, but you know, for a couple of decades, if you wanted to watch a movie, you had to go to a video store, Blockbuster, if anybody remembers Blockbuster, and you'd borrow a tape and you'd bring that tape home and you'd watch it, and then they'd ask you to be kind, rewind, and you'd rewind the tape and you'd take it back, and then you could rent another tape. And then it became DVDs, right? You could go, I think they still have DVDs in like these sort of kiosks in drugstores, red door or red something. And you sort of like, you were supposed to watch it and then return it and check out another one. The same thing was true with these. You could sort of subscribe to them, and they'd send you a set, and you go to, I don't know, let's say, you know, central parts of, you know, Native Americans, whatever. And then when you're finished and you traveled there, you could send them back and go to another place like St. Louis, or you could go to Kansas or whatever. And so, you know, you could go to the national parks, which weren't national parks yet, but became them later. And so, you know, these kinds of ways to stay at home and yet travel virtually to other places was one of photography's sort of greatest inventions. Some of them were on glass rather than on paper. And so the light would come through the back of the image, just like in a monitor or a television. And so they would sort of glow from within. And that's very close to the experience that we are used to today, either with VR goggles or some sort of just basic television or computers or phones. So, you know, we think of these things as great innovations of the late 20th and early 21st century, and yet there were versions of these things 100 years ago or more, 150 years ago. There's a kind of basic stereo view where they became beautiful objects in themselves. They, you know, brass and really finely made hardwoods that were beautifully polished, and you know, very fancy ones, very cheap ones that you could sort of carry in your pocket. They would sometimes books would be published with them in it, and so the one on the right, which is actually the one on the left, opened. You could sort of put it on the book page and look into it, and the books would come alive in 3D. You know, and they were just, if you had different visions, you would be able to adjust the thing, just like in modern cameras, we have these things called diopters where you can sort of like change, if you're not nearsighted or farsighted, you can do it with those. And and you know, the people would collect them, like they collect whatever that people collect now. It used to be records and, you know, and things like that. People would collect the sets of stereo cards, and build them into boxes and all kinds of cool stuff. Anyways, all right, so most probably popularized version of early stereo opticons was this, the 3D Viewmaster. Most people have probably at least seen, if not had, one of these. By the way, it was invented by a Black man, and he never gets credit for it, of course, but the Viewmaster was a very popular kind of distraction for not only kids, but primarily for kids. You would buy the discs in, you know, you could go to Disneyland, or you could go to the Grand Canyon and things like that. Now, more recently, of course, there's these gizmos to stick your phone inside. There's a one that the New York Times gives out, made of cardboard. And you essentially put your phone into them, and with certain kinds of apps, you can sort of see things in 3D using your phone. So this is Google Cardboard, which is the very cheapest one out there now. You can get them for less than 10 bucks. And you sort of stick your phone into it, and it then becomes a 3D stereopticon viewer, but the images are on your phone. New York Times has a whole section on the digital website of immersive news that you can go and see. And so I've mentioned this camera a few times before, but I want to go into a little bit more detail about it. So the Kodak, and that's what they called it, the Kodak initially. The Kodak camera was sort of introduced in 1888. And that's a date that you should try to remember. You should write it down. You should underline it. You should put it in bold, because it's something that I would like you to remember. So the camera, it cost $1 then in 1888, which in like today's money is a lot more. But it came loaded with a roll of film that took 100 pictures. It had a sort of very simple viewfinder, which was just a kind of window with a mirror in it that looked out. You would hold it kind of at your waist in two hands, and you would use your thumb to push down this kind of lever, and it would make a sound, it would clack. And then on the bottom, you can see of the camera, there's a winder knob that you would then turn to go to the next picture. And you take a picture and it would clack. Now, the word Kodak, some people say that's where it came from. The Kodak, the clack of the camera was like Kodak, Kodak. Like that's the sound that the camera would kind of make, Kodak. That's not true, by the way. But a lot of people like, where'd that word? It's not a word. It's not like photography, which is of Greek photos and graphis, which becomes like this new word, but it's really just based on two existing words. And no, there was no such thing, no utterance in any language. Maybe I'm not quite accurate with that, but likely in any language, the phrase, the sound Kodak. And so it was invented by a guy named George Eastman. That's another phrase, that's another person who you should write down in big bold letters and underline, and use your highlighter marker and highlight. So George Eastman invented the Kodak camera. His house, by the way, is a museum in upstate New York called the Eastman House. And it's a fantastic collection of amazing photography at the Eastman House. So the Kodak camera then became like the first camera that anybody could use. You didn't have to know anything about exposure, about optics, about processing plates and noxious chemicals that were bad for you, any of that. You just took pictures, the camera and everything went back to the company after you took your 100 clacks. You'd send the camera back to the company. They would take the film out and process it and print it, and then reload the camera for you with another roll of 100 pictures and send it back to you for another $1. And so you buy it for $1 full of film, you'd send it back to them, they would process it, and they would reload it, and they would send it back to you for $1. And that was basically the first kind of amateur snapshot camera. Now, where did the word Kodak come from? George Eastman was a wackadoodle. I mean, he was really kind of on the edge. He actually committed suicide eventually. And he thought that the letter K was a power letter. That's it. That's where it came from. He thought, oh, of all the letters in the alphabet, K, that's the strongest letter. So I'm going to use it twice in my product's name. I'm going to use the the letter K twice to get, you know, a power letter. And so that's where the word came from. It's not a thing, it's not the sound that the camera makes. It's just this kind of weird marketing idea that he had, that the letter K is a power letter. So here's some examples of the earliest Brownie. It came with a nice leather box. And I showed you last week that the first pictures were actually round that came back. And I'll show you some more of those in a bit. So here's, actually, it didn't even have a lever at the beginning. It had a string that you would pull to take the picture. So it was a winding thing in a string. And that would trigger the shutter. There was no aperture in it, by the way. It was a fixed aperture, and the shutter speed was a fixed shutter speed. So you just had to know what kind of light was the right kind of light to use to take the pictures. Now, they marketed these cameras to women, and it's going to sound very sexist because it is. They marketed it to the women because they were easy to use, and ladies couldn't understand the complexity of a real camera. And so the initial advertisements for Kodak Brownie cameras featured women. And there's the Miss Kitty Kramer, the very first so-called Kodak girl. And the Kodak girl was a kind of, late 19th, early 20th century kind of freedom that young women, or women of all ages, but particularly young women, could go out with their Kodak and go out Kodaking for the afternoon to have an activity that was suitable for young women to do, right? And so now this is the inside of the camera. It's not important because nobody did this. I mean, this was done in the factory, not at home in your darkroom. And this marketing phrase came out, and Kodak still uses it. You press the button, we do the rest. Or you can do it yourself if you want to, but really the camera was marketed to the amateur photographer who would simply send the camera back to Kodak when they were finished taking pictures. They got more sophisticated, they got more options. They became more attractive visually themselves, the cameras. They began to add shutter speed choices and aperture choices. They began to be collapsible. So that this, by the way, is called a vest pocket camera, right? And in other words, it would fold up enough so you could put it in your pocket and take it with you. See, there's your vest pocket camera, right? Put a Kodak in your pocket. And so, they became more expensive because they were more sophisticated, and also time was moving on. But the Kodak girl, the sort of icon of this, was a big part of Kodak's marketing for another 75 to 100 years, honestly. Often they portrayed women taking pictures of the family, sort of women in the role of sort of, documenting wholesome lifestyles, going to the beach, having a dinner party, going for a walk in the woods. There was also a kind of suggestion that, the Kodak girl was sophisticated and was independent and didn't need to rely on men to do, to take pictures, such sophisticated things as take pictures. And so they were portrayed as these kind of, independent young women that would be sort of brave to go. Now, always buttoned up to the very neck, not an inch of skin showing outside of the face, right? Ankles were blasphemy at the time, so there was no ankles shown. Everything was covered up. And so, but it's really interesting to look at this and sort of think about how they were marketing the camera to a certain kind of sort of young, independent-minded woman, but yet still with a kind of sexist, sort of fussy side to it. So, so now they're getting a little more risque. You're at the beach, you could actually show some arm, and would still have the kind of camera to take with you. And so, Kodak went on to develop a wide range of kinds of cameras. I think if you went to a drugstore today, at least a bigger one, you could probably still find a preloaded film camera that's meant to be shot, no shutter speed adjustments, no aperture adjustments. Some of them now have a flash, but you could take the pictures and then just take the whole camera back to the drugstore and they would process it for you. They don't give the cameras back anymore, but they actually reuse them. So even as Kodak evolved over the century or more, this iconic Kodak girl became a large part of their marketing campaign. Up until the 60s and 70s. By the way, this was my first camera ever, this Kodak 126 Instamatic. And ads in the 70s and the 60s were just so sexist. I mean, look, I can take a picture. Like this is some sort of big deal. Family, wholesome activities at home, having dinner or at the beach, dinner parties. And that's pretty awesome though, I have to say. The fashions were pretty awesome. The early snapshots were circular, right? As I mentioned, because the lens was a simple meniscus lens that fell off really profoundly in the outside corners. And so they would crop them. When Kodak invented color film, they invented the first popular and still the best ever made color film was something called Kodachrome, which was a song about. Anybody who probably over 30s heard Kodachrome by Paul Simon. The invention of color film, there's a lot of there's some videos on the web, I might show one, of how when color film was invented, it was in color, the colors that the film could reproduce, they had to make choices about. And so for those of us that used to print color in the darkroom, there were these things called Shirley cards. Now, Shirley apparently was just a secretary at Kodak who was willing to pose for Shirley cards. And what they were was a picture properly exposed with the proper color balance. And when you're printing from the color negative in the darkroom, you would try to match the neutral colors of a Shirley. And they didn't, who knows if Shirley is actually the name of this person, but for decades they published Shirley cards with different models for technicians to use in the darkroom to get the color balance right. Now, the Shirley, you'll notice, obviously is white, and the color film was developed for white people, and there's no denying it. So when this was a standard Shirley chart in almost every color darkroom in the world. There was the properly balanced one in the center, and then around it you would see two cyan, two magenta, two yellow, two green, two red, and you would then have to change the knobs on the enlarger to get back to a neutral color balance. All digital cameras, the best thing that digital cameras ever did was to have an automatic white balance, because film was designed to be used in daylight or in tungsten light, and you couldn't mix the two, right? And so now by the 70s, Oprah Winfrey, very specifically the BET, the Black Entertainment Television Channel, also began to notice most parents in the 60s, most African-American parents in the 60s, that knew that the pictures of their kids and their families sucked, because the skin tone, the color balance of the film was balanced for white folks. And it didn't work very well for people with darker complexions. So BET and Oprah Winfrey television basically made it clear that there is a market for films that are more appropriate for people with darker skin. And they began to develop not only film but television cameras, movie cameras, etc., that worked better for everybody than just for white people. So this is well into the 80s, by the way. And so Kodak color film was essentially racist until the 80s. And so, but there has been some, although not universal, changing. Apparently some facial recognition programs still don't work very well with people with darker skin. So that could be good or bad, but who knows? I'm going to step way back now. I'm going to go back to, remember the first three people we talked about were Nesfor Nepsha, the Fox Talbot, and the daguerreotype, and all of their processes had serious flaws, right? The daguerreotype, there was no negative. The Talbotype or the calotype had a negative, but it had the paper grains of the paper part of the negative. And so the next big innovation that came along, and this lasted a very long time, by the way, was collodion. Now, collodion is used in a variety of different ways, and it's still, I should say, it's had a huge resurgence recently of people who have gone back to doing this process. But basically, there's this this gooey stuff, kind of the consistency of honey, that in a dim room, it doesn't have to be completely dark, but the less ultraviolet light, the better. You sort of coat this sticky stuff on a piece of glass. And it takes a little bit of skill to learn how to actually kind of like evenly coat the piece of glass. And then you dip that into a silvering bath, because inside the collodion there's a salt. So you mix the salt in the collodion with silver and you get silver iodide, another kind of silver salt. Now, stick that in the camera, take the picture. The only problem with collodion is you then have to process it right then. It can't dry. So you have to coat the wet plate with sticky, gooey stuff, take the picture, and then have a dark room with you and process the plate. By the way, this is prior to the Kodak Brownie and all those other processes I just mentioned. Now, the actual let me find the technique and just check the time. It's 1 o'clock. So let's do our 15-minute break now. Hello, everybody. I'm back. So we were just about to begin to talk about the sort of third major photographic process, which is known as collodion. And I'd mentioned that collodion was kind of like a sticky substance. I'm going to show a video now of someone making a collodion print, or a collodion negative, I should say. So can you all see it? See it?
Up until photography, only the very wealthy who could afford to have portraits painted had any notion of what their ancestors looked like. Photography was used primarily for portraits because people is what we are primarily interested in. We see it as a very popular way to do what we've always wanted to do, which is to record the features of people we love.
I'm going to show you a collodion negative on glass. And I'm just going to put that here very carefully. This process was invented in 1851 by Frederick Scott Archer.
In the 1850s, you had the daguerreotype, you had the calotype paper negative. The daguerreotype was a commercial success. The plate that they hand the customer is the same plate that was in the camera. There's no negative.
What you got with the calotype was a negative, and it was a negative that could be reproduced very easily. You could print dozens, even hundreds of positive prints from that negative, but it made a very soft photograph.
It was much less sensitive than the daguerreotype. You couldn't do portraits easily with that process.
The desire was to have the reproducibility of a positive-negative process with the precision and detail of the daguerreotype.
But in 1851, Frederick Scott Archer invented a process called the wet collodion process. The wet plate process can give you a negative to make paper prints. It can give you a direct positive plate called an ambrotype, and another direct positive plate called a tintype. When you do the wet plate process, you make a glass negative, and that glass negative can then be contact printed onto various printing processes and make thousands and thousands of prints. By the time you get to the late 1850s, really replaces the daguerreotype.
The positive-negative process won out, in part because it was more economically viable.
It does require some advanced planning when you're taking it on the road. You have to have a portable darkroom. You pour the collodion on the plate, you dip it in the silver bath, and while it's dripping wet with silver nitrate, you take the picture, come back, and develop it, and you have to do all of that before the plate dries. And so the people that made landscape images, they had to carry a wagon with all of their chemicals. It was a challenge.
So you can see on this negative the pore marks, which are characteristic of the wet collodion process. See this kind of wave up here, that's a pore mark from when the photographer poured the developer onto the glass. The camera that took this photograph would have had to have been quite large in order to accommodate a negative of this size.
You could do a lot of things with collodion besides make a negative. You could back it with black paper or black cloth, and you ended up with a positive. These kinds of photographs, they were called ambrotypes, were generally cased and presented in the same way that daguerreotypes were. You could expose a positive onto a metal plate, and for funny reasons, these were called tintypes, even though they weren't made on tin. Tintypes were one of the earliest truly democratic kinds of photography. During the American Civil War, we see hundreds, thousands of tintype images made by soldiers to send a picture home.
This is a Lewis, HB Lewis wet plate cameras, basically your typical Civil War portrait cameras. So a camera that the tintypes of the soldiers would have been made of.
Photography shaped the way we remember things. It's a really important cultural change, no longer through ballads and poems and stories, but through looking at a likeness is the way we remember what happened and who was.
Okay, so so the collodion process comes along, and it makes the, as you just said, it becomes much more sort of democratic process. That's the wrong one. And so, you know, the idea that soldiers, usually very young, not very, you know, well off financially, people could afford to make a picture becomes, you know, accessible. I'm gonna change modes here for a moment, and Okay, so all right, so I'm gonna see if I can do this, and you won't be able to see what I'm doing, but so now last week we sort of looked at a daguerreotype, and like you can see, it really is kind of hard to get in just the right place to be seeing what's going on. And so, and remember, of course, they're in these really elaborate cases with, you know, sort of elaborately detailed leather and metal and glass. And so people became accustomed to these fancy cases. And so when this process sort of fell out of favor, we moved on to the collodion process, which, so here's a tintype. And you can see that, maybe I can't see what I'm seeing. So, you can see that no matter sort of how I move the camera, we can still see the image of the subject. Now, they were considerably less expensive, less fragile. Here's a sort of group of them that, so you can see the posing chair. She probably has one of the stands behind her. This is one of those invisible mother pictures, right? With the mother sort of shrouded in a cloth behind the baby. I think that's just my web camera that's making it out of focus. Another baby picture, but you can see in this one that the baby is moving. And so there's motion blur in the baby, which was why they would often do this other kind of thing to try to hold them still. Dude bro's going to have a, you know, picture made. Hey, let's go down to the studio and take some pictures, right? Bizarre haircuts. Look at my new haircut. Yeah, there we go. And another weird haircut. Shaven. You'll notice that, you know, so far most of the men have been shaven, which is a new sort of thing as well. Beard styles changed. Different religious castes have different thoughts about facial hair, men's facial hair. The typical handlebar mustache that we all associate with, you know, the bone shaker and stuff. Now, she briefly showed you something like this, which is, and as you can see, it's very elaborate. It has a kind of brass locking mechanism, inlaid leather cover. Unfortunately, the spine or the binding is broken in this one, but you can sort of open it up. And these are later, the ones at the front are later portraits. Here's a tintype portrait. It's much smaller. Another baby tintype portrait. And so these are bound in a book. And it's a book of, wait for it, faces. It's a face book, right? And so here's the first Facebook. And people would collect pictures of their family, of their friends. It was very popular if you went to visit someone, especially someone that was close to you. You would bring them a picture of yourself that they could then keep in their Facebook. When young ladies were being courted, young men would show up at their door with their picture, and they would hand it to the servant, who would then bring the photograph of their potential suitors into the drawing room where they're drinking tea and whatever else they're doing. And then they would sort of look at the dude and say, nah, not him, not today. I'm washing my hair. He looks kind of interesting. Let him in, let's have tea, whatever that means. And so, people would also collect pictures of famous people to include in their Facebook. All of these photographs, by the way, on the back have these very elaborate designs of the photographer's studio, their addresses, and every kind of, it's like their calling card, their business card. People would dress up to go to the photo studio to have pictures made. And so we'll talk more about cartes de visite as it comes along, but group portraits also were made. Soldiers with fancy painted backgrounds, without fancy painted backgrounds, with their uniforms on. Some were hand painted. So here's one that has been hand retouched with color. All kinds of hairstyles and dress styles and ties and collars, and he's sitting in a braided chair, by the way. There would be allegorical scenes sort of included in them. This is one of my favorites. I just love this girl. Sort of interesting pose, beautiful hair, and then spanking the baby. Don't know what that's about. So these were, fairly common around the turn of the 20th century, when it's another beautiful one. And just while I'm here, I want to show, this is a 19th century cyanotype that I own of a ship. And the tintype process, or the collodion process, I should say, also yielded something that she mentioned called an ambrotype. Now, an ambrotype is on glass. And so this is an example of an ambrotype. It's either glass painted black on the backside, or sometimes a sort of reddish glass, which is how the ambro came from as the subject, as the actual substrate. Again, it's sort of in these beautiful, leather bound glass, hand chased metal cases. And then I just wanted to sort of show that people are still doing this. So here's a portrait of my family a couple years ago. And one of the graduates from Lehman College sort of took up this process and made, sorry about the movement of the camera, made this image of my family. So Lou graduated photo from Lehman and took up the collodion process. He actually went to study with Mark Osterman, who we've seen. Now, I also want to point out in this image that, if you can see it, this sort of swirly thing that happened to the trees behind us. This was done on Governor's Island, by the way. And so that's the nature of the lens, right? I said that they were really sharp in the center, these early lenses, but they would then fall apart towards the outside edges. And since he was using a vintage era lens to make this, it has this, what they call swirly bokeh. People love the swirly bokeh. And, all right, so I'll change back to the regular camera. I see Ashley's hand is up. Ashley?
Yeah. So I know you mentioned collodion.
Right.
Now, there's something called rigid collodion that's used for special effects.
I was going to ask the same thing.
Yeah, I've used it before, and it burns when you put it on. So I'm thinking, like, I tried to find the difference between the two, but I can't really seem to find, like, any answers about it. So is it the same thing that's used?
I'm not sure because I don't know anything about rigid collodion. It sounds.
I actually looked it up on the break, and I think they say it's pretty much the same, like chemically. It's just a little runnier, but it is sticky. It dries like instantly on the skin, and it like tenses up.
Yeah.
So I think chemically it's the same. It's just they switch it a little bit.
I like water to it, so because you put it on your skin and like, tightens it up, so you're able to like scars and like burn marks if you wanted. But I was thinking like, I wonder if it's like the same thing, because if it is, it's kind of dangerous. So it's like, it's one of those things where it's used for photos, but also used for like special effects. So.
How is it dangerous? I'm sorry, I had to step away.
She was just wondering if it is dangerous because it's used for photography, but also on the skin. So I think chemically,
actually, it's funny you say this because it was initially developed to use for wounds on the Civil War battlefield. So when soldiers would be shot with deep gouges in parts of their body, they would pour this collodion stuff on them to stop the bleeding and to make a sort of temporary bandage. So the phrase or the term collodion, doesn't specifically mean photographic things. It has other applications in the world than that. We'll say one of the biggest, dangers, if you will, of it is that it's highly flammable. It's actually very close to the same formula as nitroglycerin. So if it ages or if it gets bumped in a certain way, it will spontaneously combust and explode, literally like nitroglycerin. So, but yeah, it's used in other things other than photography, certainly. So I hope that makes sense. And
yes, thank you.
I have a remark.
Sorry?
I have a remark. Just when you showed the old pictures, I'm old and I remember the album of my grandparents. There would always be on the back of the pictures dedications, like poem-like dedication, like eternity dedication, like sometimes people would immigrate and would never see again each other, but with the pictures of each other's.
Sure.
So
absolutely.
the words were very important to go with the image.
Well, there are also so few images that spending a few extra minutes writing on the back, whatever, the date, the name of the person, the location it was taken at, or more, beloved brother of, or something along those lines, would have been, more common because the pictures were more rare and you had more time to sort of think about them and look at them. So I'm gonna get back to the lecture, but so that this third major photographic process is collodion. And collodion, as was pointed out, it has a lot of uses. It can be used as a negative. It can be used as a positive by backing the negative with something dark or photographing it on black glass or amber glass, which is the ambrotype process, or you can do them onto metal, which people call tin types, but really aren't on tin. They're actually on standard pieces of iron. And so they were much less expensive, right? But they still had that tradition of sort of putting them in the fancy cases because people had gotten used to that a photograph was special and that it should come in a special case or some kind of, precious little box. So then, as things went along, people began to realize that it takes a lot of light to take a picture. These early processes were very slow. They involved a lot of very bright light. Sunlight is always best for photography. But there are times you need to take a picture when you just don't have enough light. And so they started developing ways of introducing artificial light. Most famously is this flash powder stuff. So it's basically a controlled explosion, and you'll notice these sparks coming off in different ways. Photographers' arms would be just scarred with all these little burn marks from the flash powder dropping onto their skin. And it's basically a sort of handle with almost like a lighter clicker. You know how you like turn that wheel on a lighter to get the spark to light the gas on the lighter? It's kind of like that, but instead of lighting gas, you light this magnesium powder. And magnesium is highly flammable. And it's also, when it burns very bright. It also makes a lot of smoke. So, there were different kinds of ways of using the magnesium powder. And there were different kinds of sparkers and clickers to get it lit. The further away from you, the photographer, the camera, the better, which is still the case. On-camera flash is kind of the worst light we can ever have. So getting the light off of the camera and away from the camera gives a better looking picture. These tools were kind of for two purposes. One, to help, obviously to light the picture. That's the main purpose. But also then the tools would help you not burn yourself or catch things on fire, which is another very possible thing to happen. So what happened later is that they started putting that stuff onto metal, like steel wool, and putting a glass bulb around it. And those became flash bulbs. But initially, it was just the magnesium powder being sparked by the photographer. So the shutter would open. You would open the shutter, then you would burn the magnesium powder, and then you would close the shutter, and that would be the exposure time. So I'm going to show this short video of the powder being used. We're going to come back to this. You'll see it at another time when we talk about Jacob Riis, who was a photographer in New York City. But let me get this started. And
well, you may have seen in early films when the photographers would be...
All right, I know you're not seeing it yet, so let's share screen, go to there, and...
Well, you may have seen in early films when the photographers would be carrying one of these flash lamps here. Okay, and there's a little ridge here, and on the ridge we have some magnesium powder and another metal, aluminium powder. And this is going to react in a moment, but not with the oxygen from the air, but with oxygen from another chemical called sodium perchlorate. Okay, so we're going to put an electric current across here, which should trigger this reaction. And this is exactly the same sort of thing that early photographers used to do. They used to hold this themselves. Well, I'm not going to hold it. I'm going to step back here. Okay, so we'll have a countdown again. 3, 2, 1. There we are. There's a rather nice smoke ring that's forming at the top.
So you can imagine, what that would be like inside a studio while you're, here we go, there it is. While you're taking a picture of people, it would really smoke them out. And so, this lecture is really sort of devoted to early advancements in the discipline of photography, especially in the 19th century. But this one allowed people to take pictures inside, in dark places at night, places they couldn't normally take photographs. There was recently a sort of cable show about some photographer photographed corpses, and they sort of, showed in the show that the photographer could take a picture in a church at night with a collodion camera, which is absolutely impossible. Going back to Muybridge, who we talked about earlier, with the invention of the fast high-speed shutter, his obsession with the animals in motion, humans in motion, etc. Really, it took up the last half of his life, and he photographed almost every conceivable animal that moves. And really, it's kind of amazing how he got animals from all over the world to come to his studio to do this. Probably they weren't treated very well afterward, but his influence is really sort of huge. And of course, he becomes this link between still photography and the moving picture and video and movies, essentially. So that if you were to take those pictures of Sally Mae, the horse galloping, and flip them in front of your eyes fast enough, like a flip book or that doodling you did in the corner of your notebook during math class, then it would sort of like appear that the horse is galloping, is running in front of you. So that eventually became film and cinema. We saw these pictures of the studio. I'm sorry, they're in there again, but you can see if you sort of quickly move them. So then he got, other kinds of things. Now he thought of these as illustrations for artists, that painters, illustrators, etc., would use these photographs for some kind of accurate way to create their work with, not as art themselves, but instead as kind of sources for other people's art. They started to get, a little bit risque, right? Two women throwing water at each other naked. Every animal, is that a dromedary or a camel? I can't remember. Birds flying, all kinds of, mules and asses and horses and draft horses, and women dancing in flowy skirts, men with disabilities walking from in front, from the side, and from behind, all at the same time. Guys with a diaper and a gun. I don't know what that's about, but diaper and a gun. Hey, some guy with is that a woman with a stick and a rock and some rocks that she's walking on? Who knows? And so there were thousands and thousands of these that were made, and he just sort of took this idea and just went with it in really bizarre and strange directions ultimately. So it looks like I'm running out of time. I've got about, let's say 7 minutes left or so. And so I'm going to go through these quickly. All right, so we're just about out of time, but are there any questions for today? Let me show you something. I think I have the syllabus. So we're essentially one full class session behind already. Now that's my fault, but so this lecture that I gave today was the early technologies lecture. So we haven't quite finished it. We're going to go finish this one next week and move into landscapes. So the weekly count is 1 off. Your assignments continue to be for you to read or watch the links here. Now this next reading assignment is rather, it's rather like, it takes a while. I'm searching for the word, but it's a 3-part series of articles written by Errol Morris, who's a cinematographer, by the way. He's a fantastic filmmaker who's done really, really interesting movies. But this is about Roger Fenton, the photographer, and 2 pictures of a battlefield scene. And the question is, which one came first of the 2 photographs? And so it's 3 parts long article. It's in the New York Times. You can, I think, get a couple of, maybe 10 free views of the Times without a subscription, but your CUNY, being a CUNY student, you can get the New York Times for free. So, if you've run out of New York Times views, then you can sign up for a subscription of the Times for free. So that's kind of where we are in terms of the syllabus and the assignments. Any questions?
I know we don't have anything to submit, I guess, for next week. We just have to read, but in the future, I guess I rectified the situation by switching, the last document to .doc, but I'm doing stuff from a MacBook, so I have Pages. So when I upload things in the future, is Pages an acceptable, format for Blackboard?
It is. I also am working from a Mac, so yes.
Okay, good. All right.
Any other questions?
It's a technical question about cameras now, at least a 35mm. If you don't have a flash, but you want to bring in more light, is that when you would open, I guess, the shutter? No, not the shutter, the aperture more to bring in light?
Both are true. So if you have the shutter open longer, in other words, a slower shutter speed, more light will come in, right? If you open up the aperture, that iris thing, like your eye, more light will come in. In basic photography classes, we talk about the difference those 2 things do to the appearance of the photograph, because they do affect the way it looks. But essentially, if you need more light, if your light meter in a DSLR or 35mm camera says it's underexposed, you need to do one of those 2 things, either a longer shutter speed or open up the iris, the aperture in the camera. So, any other questions? All right, so I'll see you guys next week at our normal time at 11:20 on Thursday, and have a good week, and I'll talk to you later.
Thank you again.
Bye, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good one.
Oh, wait.
Thank you.
I have one last question. I'm sorry. Could you just write in the chat, and like in a minute or 2, what your preferences for your fall 21 style of learning is? And you can just put in class, online asynchronous, online synchronous, or hybrid. So you've got like 4 choices. None of these are right or wrong. I'm just taking a survey because I'm trying to schedule courses, but I'd like to know what you guys prefer. Could you please do that for me? Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm going to close I'm going to close the meeting in about a minute or so. And so if you don't get it there, it's no big deal. I see you all doing it. This is great. Okay, thank you so much. Hybrid seems to be the most popular. Asynchronous, excellent. Okay.
Professor, I did have one question.
Yes.
What do you think about mirrorless cameras?
What?
Mirrorless cameras, the way that they've been advancing over the years, especially with Sony.
It's fine. I think they're the next thing. I have to give my machine to my wife, but if you want to hold that question or even email that question to me, but yes, they're the next common camera, I think.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Yep.